Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. This article from the front page of the Delhi edition provides us an update with regard to the ongoing India-China border dispute. According to this article, both India and China have arrived at a mutual consensus to disengage from the border standoff in a phased manner. Both the countries have arrived at this decision at a meeting of senior military commanders which has been held as per established protocols, agreements and confidence building measures that have been put in place between 1993 and 2013. But we should also note that a similar meeting was held on the 6th of June as well, during which both the sides had agreed for a limited disengagement, but eventually it led to clashes at the Galwan River Valley, which resulted in the death of more than 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese soldiers. So this time around, India would be hoping that China would uphold its end of the bargain and live up to its commitments, which could pave the way for a phased disengagement at the border. Now let's take up another article from page number 1 that is related to India's relations with Pakistan. India's Ministry of External Affairs has decided to downgrade diplomatic ties with Pakistan by reducing the diplomatic presence of both the countries in their respective high commissions. India has ordered Pakistan to cut the strength of its staff by nearly 50% at its High Commission in Delhi, and it has given Pakistan a 7-day notice to take back its officials and diplomats who have been posted at its High Commission in New Delhi. India has also decided to reduce its own diplomatic presence at its High Commission in Islamabad as well. There are two reasons why India has decided to take this drastic step. One, India has accused the officials and diplomats of Pakistan posted at its High Commission in New Delhi of being involved in activities of espionage and terrorism against India. And two, India has blamed Pakistan's security agencies for kidnapping and torturing Indian officials and diplomats who were posted at its High Commission in Islamabad. So in response to these recent incidents, India has decided to downgrade its diplomatic ties with Pakistan, and it has ordered Pakistan to reduce its diplomatic strength in New Delhi by nearly 50%. And along with this, India would also be downgrading its diplomatic presence in Islamabad. While making these decisions known to Pakistan, India has said that Pakistan has violated the terms of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961. See, the world of diplomacy and international relations is built on the principle of reciprocity and mutual respect. This world is built on the principle of give and take, so essentially you get what you give, and it is not uncommon to witness such tit-for-tat responses, especially between countries that are hostile towards each other. See, in international relations, there is a long history of diplomats and officials being mistreated and harassed by the host country. Especially when two countries are hostile towards each other, the host country tries to prevent the diplomats and the officials who have been posted in embassies, high commissions and consulates from carrying out their duties and functions through a number of coercive methods, which might include harassment, following, tapping of phones and interception of internet communication, issuing of threats, and even going to the extent of kidnapping the officials, torturing them and killing them. Then it is also common for every country to use its embassies, high commissions and consulates located in other countries to carry out espionage and run covert operations against the host country. Be it India's RAW, Pakistan's ISI, the CIA of the United States, such external intelligence agencies of every country, they make use of their respective embassies, high commissions and consulates to place intelligence operatives and agents under the cover of diplomats and consular officials in order to carry out espionage and run covert operations against the host country. So in order to break up these spy modules that are operating out of embassies, high commissions and consulates, the host country deploys its counter-intelligence teams to identify these intelligence operatives who are functioning under the cover of diplomats and consular officials. So in their effort to identify these undercover intelligence operatives, the counter-intelligence teams quite often end up targeting and harassing regular diplomats and officials, and this in turn invites a tit-for-tat response from the other country, leading to the deterioration of diplomatic relations between the two. But if two countries share a friendly relationship, then the identity of a few intelligence operatives might be revealed to the host country through bilateral arrangements. But if two countries are hostile towards each other, And if they share a lot of suspicion against each other, then the external intelligence agency of the other country ends up deploying a number of undercover operatives in its embassies, high commissions, and consulates, leading to a shadow war or a covert war between the counterintelligence of the host country and the external intelligence agency of the other country. And as a result of this shadow war, even regular diplomats and officials end up being targeted and harassed. In fact, India and Pakistan share a long history of such incidents, and Pakistan's counterintelligence in particular has been extremely brutal against Indian diplomats and against Indian intelligence operatives. Similar conflicts have been seen between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. Now it continues between the United States and Russia, and there have been a number of similar incidents between the US and China as well. There was an era where India used to resort to a tit-for-tat response against the brutalities of Pakistan's counterintelligence. But now, with the emergence of India as a more mature and responsible power, it abides by the terms of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and it takes appropriate diplomatic action. This includes the complete suspension of diplomatic ties or a drastic reduction in the diplomatic presence of both the countries at their respective high commissions. See, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations was adopted in 1961 in order to prevent the occurrence of such incidents and establish standard protocols for the world of diplomacy and international relations. This convention basically provides a framework for diplomatic relations between two countries, and it recognizes a set of diplomatic rights and privileges. These diplomatic privileges extend to the entire diplomatic mission, including all the properties of the diplomatic mission, all the vehicles, and as well as all the diplomats and officials who are working as a part of the diplomatic mission. The objective of the Vienna Convention is to ensure that diplomats in a host country are allowed to perform their functions and duties without the element of fear or without the element of coercion or harassment by the host country. It is this convention which provides the legal basis for diplomatic immunity for diplomats in order to protect them against such coercive methods of the host country. So over the last few weeks, there have been incidents where Indian officials in Pakistan have been kidnapped and tortured by Pakistan's security agencies. And in New Delhi, Pakistani officials who were deployed at its High Commission have been caught for being involved in espionage and terror-related activities against India. So that's the reason why India has accused Pakistan for violating the terms of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and hence it has decided to downgrade the diplomatic presence in both the countries. The last time that India ordered such a major reduction in diplomatic presence was after the 2001 Parliament attacks, which was carried out by the Jaish-e-Mohammed with the support of Pakistani state agencies. Now let's take up another article from page number 1, which deals with Government E-Marketplace or GEM. See, GEM is a e-governance and good governance initiative of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is basically a public procurement platform that was established as a special purpose vehicle in 2016 under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. In its functioning, it is quite similar to any other e-marketplace such as Flipkart or Amazon. See, e-marketplaces such as Flipkart or Amazon, they bring the buyer, that is private consumer, in touch with the seller. Similarly, GEM or Government E-Marketplace is dedicated for public procurement. It brings the buyers involved in public procurement, that is government departments, government agencies and public sector undertakings, in touch with sellers. So through this e-marketplace, government agencies, government organizations and PSUs, they can procure directly from private sellers. This e-governance initiative was launched in order to promote greater transparency and efficiency with regard to public procurement and also to speed up the process of public procurement. Through this platform, government organizations and PSUs, they can procure anything that they require from the market. This could include something as simple as office stationery and furniture, going all the way up to computers, machinery, etc. So under this e-marketplace, the government has made it mandatory for all the sellers to list the country of origin of the products while registering new products on the platform. The requirement of listing the country of origin has been made mandatory in order to promote local products, which is in line with the objectives of the Atmanirbhar Bharat and Make in India initiatives of the government. So henceforth, the sellers will have to list the country of origin of the product that they are selling, and as well as the percentage of indigenous content in the product that they are selling. This will help the public procurement agencies to be mindful of the percentage of local content in the products that they are purchasing. The Ministry of Commerce has also said that henceforth there will be a dedicated Make in India filter on the platform in order to allow the public procurement agencies to see the products that match their preferences on local content. Now let's take up another article from page number 1. US President Donald Trump has signed a controversial executive order that severely restricts America's immigration and visa policy. This executive order signed by the president basically suspends a number of non-immigrant work visas issued by the US government, including the H-1B, H-4, L-1, H-2B, etc. The suspension of these work visas has been extended till the end of this year, and in all likelihood, if President Trump is re-elected in this year's presidential elections, this ban on non-immigrant work visas might very well be extended into 2021 as well. The US government has said that this decision has been taken in order to protect American jobs as a result of increasing unemployment caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But however, this decision of the United States is bound to affect the movement of Indian professionals and as well as the Indian industry, particularly the information technology industry. See, even though this is a domestic policy decision of the US government, the topic becomes relevant for our exams because this decision of Donald Trump is bound to affect the well-being of Indian nationals, Indian diaspora, and as well as the Indian industry. So essentially, this decision affects the national interests of India. And if you look at the syllabus of GS Paper 2 under International Relations, it has been clearly mentioned that policies of foreign governments affecting India's national interests is a part of our syllabus. So in this context, let us take a look at this editorial on page number 6, which evaluates the decision of the US government. See, these restrictions apply for various types of non-immigrant work visas, including the H-1B, which is given out to skilled professionals, the H-2B, which is given out to non-agricultural workers and seasonal workers who work in the landscaping and hospitality industry. It also applies for L1 visa, which is given for intra-company transfers, and it also affects the H-4 visa, which is given out to the immediate dependents of H-1B visa holders. But amongst all these visas, the restrictions on H-1B is bound to affect Indians the most, because skilled Indian professionals are the largest recipients of the H-1B visa, and it allows them to temporarily reside and work in the United States. So the suspension of the H-1B visa will not only affect the well-being of Indian students and professionals, but it will also affect the Indian industry, especially the technology industry, which sends across a number of Indian workers in order to execute their offshore projects. This decision of the US government is in line with Trump's America First policy, and the US government has justified this decision by stating that it has become essential to protect American jobs and prevent these jobs from going away to foreign workers, especially during the pandemic. Because the pandemic has disrupted economic growth in the United States, and as a result, unemployment rates have grown significantly over the last 3 to 4 months. Unemployment data from Feb to April shows that around 20 million Americans have lost their jobs, and the companies have replaced a number of them by foreign workers who work on temporary work visas. Even though this concern of the US government is understandable and partly genuine, such a decision in a globalized world can be seen as a protectionist policy. And championing such protectionist policies has always been the primary objective of the Trump administration, which won the 2016 presidential elections on the basis of its America First policy. But such a conservative immigration policy ignores the fact that the diversity and strength of the US economy and the US society is based on its liberal approach towards welcoming skilled immigrant workers. So this leads the editorial to conclude that the decision of the US president is not just based on the economic imperatives created by the pandemic, but it has been motivated by Trump's need to again project the America First policy and appear to be protecting American jobs as a part of his 2020 presidential campaign. The editorial also notes that this decision has already been criticized by the Indian industry and as well as by the tech industry of the United States. In another related article on page number 10, it has been noted that tech giants have slammed and criticized this decision of the US government. This article notes that the decision of the US government is bound to affect Indian IT companies such as TCS, Cognizant, Infosys, etc., and as well as American tech companies such as Google, Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, which employ a number of foreign workers. In fact, the CEO of Google, Mr. Sundar Pichai, has openly criticized this decision of the US government, and similar sentiments have been expressed by the industry leaders of India as well. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, written by retired Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, in which he illustrates the significance of India's air power in deterring China's aggression. See, the writer talks about the asymmetry in the balance of power between the Indian Armed Forces and the Chinese PLA, and he attributes this to the land-centric operational philosophy that has been long followed by India's political leadership and as well as by the Indian Army. This land-centric operational philosophy of the government and the Indian Army has diluted the role for the Indian Air Force along China's border. This argument can be best illustrated by going back to the 1962 conflict in order to understand how the failure of India to use its air force against China was one of the major contributing factors for its massive defeat. Historians and strategic experts agree that had the then Indian government deployed the air force against the advancing Chinese forces, the scale of the conflict might have been tilted in 1962. See, the top military leadership of the Indian Army was against deploying the Indian Air Force against China in the 62 war, mainly because of its land-centric operational philosophy and as well as due to its turf war with the Air Force. The political leadership as well failed to deploy the Air Force as a result of its land-centric operational philosophy, and reportedly the government was also pressurized by Britain and the United States to not deploy the Air Force against China. But in contrast, during the 1986-87 border clashes, the Army and the Air Force, they managed to jointly project India's air power in combination with the Army's land-centric operational philosophy in the Northeast, and as a result, India successfully managed to deter China. The writer says that aerial assets such as helicopters and transport aircraft can help in radically transforming military logistics, especially in a region where the geography and terrain are unfavorable. These aerial platforms can help in the deployment of troops, the dispatch of reinforcements, and as well as the delivery of essential supplies to the front lines. While air power can act as the backbone of military logistics through helicopters and transport aircraft, other aerial assets such as fighter aircraft, bomber aircrafts, they can provide a deterrent effect against the enemy by threatening to carry out both offensive and defensive operations against the ground positions and the aerial assets of the enemy. But the writer says that India has unfortunately failed to capitalize on its air power, and as a result of its land-centric operational philosophy against China, a major asymmetry in the balance of power has emerged between the Indian Armed Forces and the Chinese PLA. The writer says that despite the best efforts of the Indian Army to modernize and strengthen its deployment along the China border, it is still clearly outnumbered against the Chinese PLA, and it also has to deal with the disadvantage of terrain. Since the Chinese forces occupy the Tibetan Plateau, they enjoy a vantage position, creating more geographical hurdles for the Indian Army, which is clearly outnumbered by the PLA. Then upon this, the Chinese PLA enjoys a clear logistical and infrastructure superiority as compared to the Indian Army. Through its well-developed border infrastructure and supply chains, China is in a position to quickly deploy thousands of troops to the forward areas, and in comparison, the poor logistics and poor infrastructure on the Indian side hampers the operational capabilities of the army. So in this regard, the writer says that the Indian Air Force can help the Indian Army to bridge this asymmetry in the balance of power through its force multipliers. In fact, a recent study conducted by the Harvard Kennedy School has shown that the Indian Air Force enjoys a qualitative and quantitative edge over the PLA's Air Force. The study has shown that the fighter aircrafts that are in the inventory of the Indian Air Force, such as the Sukhoi 30 MKI Air Superiority Fighter Jet, the Mirage 2000 and the MiG-29s, are any day superior and have proven to have greater operational capabilities as compared to the J-10s, the J-11s and the Sukhoi 30 MKKs operated by the PLA's Air Force. Over the last couple of decades, the Indian Air Force has strengthened its capabilities along the line of actual control by developing more operational bases in the forward areas and by developing advanced landing grounds at Daulat Beg Oldi, Neoma and Mechuka, and this gives the Indian Air Force the capability to strike deep inside Chinese territory. But apart from these factors, there are a number of areas where the Indian Air Force has to catch up with China. For example, the PLA's Air Force has deployed a very strong air defense network in Tibet by acquiring the Russian S-300 and S-400 missiles. Such advanced air defense systems, along with the HQ-9 systems, can pose a grave threat to Indian fighter aircraft. And along with this, the PLA's Air Force carries long-range cruise missiles that can strike in the range of 500 to 3000 kilometers, as compared to the short range of 300 kilometers of the BrahMos cruise missile carried by the Sukhoi 30 MKI. So this gives deep strike capabilities to the Chinese Air Force as compared to the Indian Air Force. But when it comes to transport aircraft, the Indian Air Force enjoys a significant advantage over the Chinese because it operates a number of modern heavy lift transport aircrafts such as the C-17 Globemaster and the C-130J Super Hercules that India has acquired from the United States, and as well as the IL-76 that India has acquired from Russia. Such heavy lift transport aircraft in the inventory of the Indian Air Force gives it the capability to execute complicated inter-valley transfers and as well as to insert special forces behind enemy lines. Plus the recent acquisition of the Chinook helicopter and the Apache helicopter from the US and the induction of the Mi-17 helicopters from Russia further strengthens the transport capabilities of the Indian Air Force and as well as the helicopter-based attack capabilities. The Apache and the Mi-17 in particular can provide cover to the land forces, and all these platforms act as force multipliers and strengthen India's firepower along China's border, and this can help in bridging India's asymmetry with the Chinese armed forces. But another area that India needs to improve is the area of space-based surveillance and airborne surveillance. Even though India possesses a number of such space-based and aerial platforms to carry out such surveillance, China enjoys a far greater superiority. So according to the writer, if India wants to bridge this asymmetry between the Indian and the Chinese armed forces, then it needs to realize the importance and significance of projecting air power, and for this, it needs to move away from its land-centric operational philosophy. Along with this, the political and strategic leadership of the country needs to invest heavily in order to modernize the Indian Air Force and help the Indian Air Force to bridge the gap with the PLA's Air Force and help it retain its competitive advantage. So India can truly realize the role of its air power against China only when there is a well-articulated vision and acceptance of the importance of air power in combat. For this, India will have to move away from its land-centric operational philosophy and make adequate investments for modernizing the Air Force in order to help it acquire cutting-edge platforms and weapon systems. Next, on page number 14, we have an article which refers to a report of the Chinese government, according to which the increased naval deployment of the United States into the Indo-Pacific region has significantly increased the chances of a naval conflict with China. So I would request you to kindly go through this article once. Now let's move on to the practice questions for today. Which of the following statements are correct? The Malabar Rebellion began as a reaction against a heavy-handed crackdown on the Khilafat movement. It was not just a resistance against British colonial rule, but it was also a rebellion against the feudal system of southern Malabar. The most prominent leaders of the rebellion were Varian Kunnat Kunja Ahmad Haji, Siti Koya Tangal, and Ali Musaliar. All the three statements are correct, so option D is the right answer. See, the Malabar Rebellion is also known as the Mapila Rebellion or the Mopla Rebellion. This rebellion was led by the Mapila peasants or the Mopla Muslims who belong to the Malabar region of coastal Kerala. This rebellion of 1921 was triggered by the crackdown of the colonial government on the Khilafat movement, but it was not just a resistance against the British colonial government, but it was also a rebellion against the feudal system that was prevalent in the region. It was basically a rebellion of the Mapila peasants against the British rulers and as well as against the landlords who used to work with the colonial government. But later, the British colonial government managed to exploit this rebellion through its policy of divide and rule, and it managed to turn this rebellion into a communal conflict between the Hindus and the Muslims. So for this reason, the Mapila rebellion continues to remain very controversial even to this day. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 8 which makes a reference to the Malabar rebellion. Since 2021 marks the 100th year anniversary of the Malabar rebellion, a number of movies have been lined up, and this has again reignited the controversial debate surrounding the Malabar rebellion. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The S-400 Triumph of Russia is a ballistic missile capable of carrying nuclear warheads. India's deal to acquire the missile has been threatened by American sanctions. The NATO reporting name for the S-400 is the SA-21 Growler. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect, so option D is the right answer. See, the S-400 Triumph that India is planning to acquire from Russia is not a ballistic missile, and it does not carry any nuclear warhead. It is basically an air defense system that consists of a battery of surface-to-air missiles in order to target enemy aircrafts and incoming ballistic missiles. India's deal with Russia to procure the S-400 is being threatened by American sanctions under the CAATSA legislation. CAATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. This legislation passed by the US Congress seeks to place economic sanctions against any country that trades with three major adversaries of the United States, that is Russia, Iran and North Korea, in the key domains of defense, energy, etc. So due to the threat of these American sanctions, India has been seeking a one-time exemption which can be granted by the US President as per the provisions of the CAATSA legislation. Then the NATO security grouping has its own naming system for the weapons and defense platforms of Russia and China for the sake of simplicity and uniformity. As per this naming system, the NATO has named the S-400 as the SA-21 Growler. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 11, India's Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, who is currently on a visit to Russia, has requested Russia to speed up the deliveries of the S-400. The Indian Defense Minister has been invited by Russia to take part in the Victory Day Parade, which marks the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And also note that an Indian Tri-Services contingent is marching during the Victory Parade at the Red Square. Now let's take up the next practice question. With regard to money supply, M3 is also referred to as broad money. So option C is the correct answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 15 which makes a reference to money supply in the Indian economy, and it specifically mentions M3. See, money supply is nothing but the total supply of money in circulation amongst the public at a particular point of time. There are various measures of money supply such as M1, M2, M3 and M4 along with M0. This classification of the measures of money supply was introduced by the RBI in 1977. First we have reserve money or M0, which is also known as high powered money or monetary base or base money. M0 is nothing but the currency that is in circulation plus the banker's deposit with the RBI and other deposits with the RBI. M0 is basically the monetary base of the economy. Then we have narrow money, that is M1, which is the currency with the public plus demand deposits with the banking system. That includes the deposits that have been made in current account and saving accounts plus other deposits with the RBI. Then M2 also happens to be a type of narrow money, which is basically the sum of M1 plus saving deposits of post office saving banks. Then we have broad money, that is M3, which is the sum of M1 plus the time deposits with the banking system. Then M4 is the sum of M3 plus all deposits with post office savings banks. But this excludes the deposits made under the National Savings Certificate. According to this article, there is a sudden surge of money supply in the Indian economy, and this is a signal of the uncertainty that is prevalent in the economy as a result of the pandemic. See, usually an increase in money supply is seen as an indicator for economic growth and for increase in consumption. But the latest increase in money supply, especially that of M3, is being seen by economic experts as a sign of increasing holding of cash and parking of money in deposits, because the uncertainty and volatility created by the pandemic has left people worried about their jobs and their income security. So this has led people to draw more money, hold cash and to park money in deposits, thus leading to an increase in M3 supply. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. In the context of which one of the following are the terms pyrolysis and plasma glassification mentioned? The correct answer is option D. It is mentioned in the context of waste to energy technologies. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: the increasingly conservative immigration and visa policy of the United States affects the movement of Indian professionals. Discuss. The second question: illustrate the importance of projecting India's air power vis-a-vis China in what has till now been a significantly land-centric operational philosophy across the line of actual control. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. This concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.